Winston Churchill once said, quote, "There is no merit in putting off a war for a year if when that war comes, it is far worse or much harder to win," end quote. It is because I agree with Winston Churchill that when a government fails to act against a likely threat, they put the safety of their people at risk. And it's for that reason that I stand resolved. Preventive war is ethical. Now, before we get into the meat of today's round, we must first define our terms. Preventive war is defined from the Dictionary of Military and Associated Terms as, quote, "a war initiated in the belief that military conflict, while not imminent, is inevitable, and to delay would involve greater risk," end quote. Ethics are defined as a set of moral principles or a theory or system of moral values, end quote. With that established, let's jump into my ethical framework. In order to determine when something is ethical, we must have an ethical framework or a worldview that allows us to measure what actions we can deem as ethical. Every ethical theory has one thing in common. It's trying to determine when an action is morally justified. The ethical framework I propose for today's round is deontology. Deontology. The word deon comes from the Greek meaning duty. Deontology is the ethical theory that places value on fulfilling your moral obligations, or in other words, fulfilling your moral duty. There will always be some actions that have more moral value than others. Feeding your children is more important than personal pleasure. That is because you have a moral duty to the protection of your children. Deontology recognizes that a government has the moral duty to the protection of their people, which is why my value, or highest standard we should seek to uphold today, is that of protection of citizens. It's because I believe that preventive war protects a nation's people that it is morally justified and an ethical action.
It's a
To
touch screen.
condense everything I just said, governments have a moral duty to the protection of their people, and it's because preventive war fulfills that moral duty that it is a just and ethical action. And if I can prove that logical reasoning to you, I've warranted an affirmative ballot. Let's jump into contention one. Preventive war responds to threatening nations. Preventive war responds to threatening nations. Preventive war, by definition, is a war that is inevitable. The word inevitable comes from the Latin meaning inevitabilis, which means unavoidable. A country will not believe that a threat is unavoidable if other means to stop that threat have not already been avoided. There must be some foundation and some level of information in order for a country to believe that a threat is unavoidable. Because of this, we must conclude that preventive war is based on factual information, and other means like diplomacy have already been attempted and failed to end the conflict. Preventive war responds to a threatening nation. That threat may not be imminent, but it is a legitimate threat. To illustrate how this works, I present the following example. Operation Opera. Operation Opera. On June 7th, 1981, the Israeli Air Force launched their attack on the Iraqi nuclear reactor. Iraq was using this reactor to make nuclear weapons that directly threatened Israel's people. Israel used a preventive attack to ensure the safety of their people. That attack did not spark conflict, but actually helped resolve the situation. Iraq was not an imminent threat by any means, but by building that nuclear reactor, they were intentionally creating a threat to a nation they had already been hostile to. Diplomacy was attempted and failed. To ignore this threat would have directly put Israel's people in harm's way. Operation Opera was used to ensure the safety of Israel's people, which is important because of my second contention. Responding to threats fulfills a government's moral duty. Responding to threats fulfills a government's moral duty. Something we must remember is nations intentionally create threats. A nation does not accidentally create a threat towards another nation. Iraq had already been hostile towards Israel. By building a nuclear reactor, they were fully aware of the threat they proposed to Israel. When a nation uses preventive war, they use it to stop further conflict. This is known as de-escalation. Imagine if someone were to break into your house. You would be justified in using lethal force to stop that burglar. This is the same thing as preventive war, only on a governmental standard. A government's highest obligation, especially during times of war, is their protection of their citizens. So when a nation intentionally creates a threat, it's ethical to respond. Operation Opera was used against a nation that was fully aware of the threat they were creating. Preventive war ensured the safety of Israel's people, gained a strategic advantage, and stopped further conflict, ensuring or fulfilling that moral duty. Finally, let's look at my third contention. Deontology deems preventive war as ethical. Deontology deems preventive war as ethical. There will always be some actions that have more moral value than others. This is what deontology recognizes. A government has the duty to the protection of their people, and when they fail to uphold that moral duty, they in turn have acted unjustly. To illustrate this, let's look at an example proposed by Alan Buchanan, professor of international law at Penn State. It's known as the lethal virus case. Country A has good evidence from multiple sources that there is a terrorist group that has in its possession a lethal virus that they plan to release in a crowded city. This virus is extraordinarily contagious, and there is presently no cure. There's no reason to believe this attack is imminent, but it is an inevitable attack. A missile strike against the terrorist group's remote mountain stronghold would destroy the virus and kill all terrorists involved. Alan Buchanan said, quote, "Surely under these circumstances, preventive force would be ethical," end quote. It is because a nation has the moral duty to its citizens that it was ethical to use Operation Opera, just like it would be ethical to use lethal force against that terrorist group. Deontology recognizes this, and it's why preventive war should be deemed as ethical.
Alrighty, so with 3 minutes on the clock, Seth, if you're ready.
Yes.
Perfect. Let's get started. I want to talk a little bit about deontology. So deontology is this idea that you have a moral duty to do something, right?
Yes.
So it looks at duty, right?
Yes.
Could you fulfill your duty in an immoral way?
Well, normally, if a country is fulfilling a moral duty that they have in an immoral way, it's because they violated another moral duty that they have.
Right. Okay, perfect. But considering just overall protection of citizens, let's say, could you protect your citizens in an immoral way?
If you are not violating another moral duty while protecting your citizens, there's no way to do it immorally.
Right, but specifically talking about just the context of war in general. Again, could you so essentially you're saying that you have to violate another moral duty, right?
Yes.
Do you think that unnecessary war is ethical?
Well, it depends on how you define unnecessary war and what your standard for war is, because I would say, and I would probably think that we have different standards on what makes a war necessary.
Interesting. So would you agree that the ends don't justify the means?
I would say the ends can justify the means. For instance, working out justifies the end result that you get.
Right,
Or the end result justifies working out.
As a principle, just because we achieve a justified end doesn't mean that we're achieving it through a moral way, right? Or moral means.
I would say the ends can justify the means, but it doesn't necessarily mean they will.
Interesting. You talked about considering your definition of preventive war, it talked about inevitability. You would agree that the resolution or the definition says belief of inevitability, right?
Yes.
So essentially, we don't know for sure if it's inevitable, but just based on the evidence presented by that country, if we were to do nothing, then it would be an inevitable conflict, right?
Yes, and I clarified that in my first contention, talking about the root word inevitable and what it takes for a country to believe that a threat is inevitable.
Sure. I want to talk a little bit about Operation Opera. So Operation Opera, essentially, there was this Osiris, or I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but there was this reactor that Iraq had, and Israel decided to take out before it became an imminent threat.
Excuse me, you cut out a little bit.
Oh, sorry. So essentially in this situation, there was a nuclear reactor that Iraq had, and Israel decided to attack it before it became an imminent threat, right?
Yes. So essentially what happened is Iraq was building a nuclear reactor, and Israel tried diplomacy to figure out what they were using it for, but ultimately it posed such a significant threat that they needed to eliminate it.
Okay, interesting. So based on the intel they had, they believed that the threat was so big that they had to attack.
Well, yes, they tried diplomacy and they tried other means to stop it, but it wouldn't work.
Was the threat an imminent threat? Were they about to attack?
No. So what was happening is they were in the process of building the nuclear reactor. So Israel saw that they were building this. It wasn't imminent, but they needed to eliminate it before they had the ability to harm Israel's people.
Okay, interesting. Thanks. No further questions. I'll be using a minute of prep time. No further prep time needed. And with 7 minutes on the clock, I'm just going to assume that everyone is ready and go ahead and get started. Mankind must put an end to war before war puts an end to mankind. John F. Kennedy. We can all agree that war is not something that a country should just throw around. However, the affirmative side creates a world where the only criteria necessary to justify an attack is a belief that a nation might be harmed sometime in the distant future. It's because this world is full of unnecessary conflict that preventive war can't be deemed ethical. I want to start off by talking about this idea of deontology. I would agree that deontology is a good moral framework, and actually I agree to the value of protection of citizens. But I have one point that we need to clarify, which you can tag as that protection of citizens is not enough. Again, protection of citizens is not enough. The fact of the matter is that nations can fulfill this duty of protecting of citizens in immoral ways. If I protect my citizens through an immoral way, or if I protect my citizens by using chemical warfare, that's obviously immoral. So what we need is something to keep the means in check. And with that in mind, I'd like to present the criterion of the just war theory. The just war theory is a moral checklist for warfare. The just war theory has different criteria that must be met before an act of war is considered ethical. According to Oregon State University, quote, the just war theory is the basis on which nations seek to legally and morally justify going to war. The history of the just war theory begins in the works of some important philosophers. Augustine provides a foundation for the just war theory in Western literature. Thomas Aquinas codified Augustine's reflections into the distinct criteria that remain the basis of the just war theory as it is used today. What this means is that the standard used to decide if preventive war is ethical is protection of citizens through the just war theory. And there's one reason why I think we need this criterion. You can tag as it keeps the means in check. Again, it keeps the means in check. The ends don't justify the means. Just because we protect citizens doesn't automatically make preventive war ethical. So we need to ensure that it fulfills the just war theory and also protects citizens. And the just war theory has many different criteria to ensure that it's actually moral. And I want to point out, if I can prove that that preventive war fails just one criterion, then I have proved that preventive war is unethical. Contention 1 is that preventive war undermines the just war theory. Again, preventive war undermines the just war theory. Remember, the only criteria necessary to justify violence under preventive war is a belief that conflict is going to happen sometime in the future. If we say that preventive war is ethical, then we are allowing nations to skip the other criteria that are necessary to justify war. This is incredibly dangerous because it would deem ethical actions which are obviously unethical. We will be examining 2 of those criteria and using real-world example to prove this point. Subpoint A is that preventive war is not proportional. One of the most crucial criteria for the just war theory is that an action taken is a proportional response. However, with preventive war, the only information necessary to justify an attack is if an attack is going to happen, not what that attack is going to be. So how can your response be proportional if you don't even know what the attack is in the first place? I'm not saying that every preventive war is not proportional. Rather, if we establish preventive war as ethical, then we are allowing for violence that is not proportional and therefore unethical. But subpoint B is that preventive war is not a last resort. Another criterion of the just war theory is that the action taken is the last resort. In preventive war, the threat that is perceived is not imminent, so the attack itself is not about to happen. This means that there are always other options that can be used before a nation attacks. One of those options is economic sanctions. Instead of violence, a nation or group of nations can cut off trade to use as leverage. An example of this are the sanctions used on North Korea. If preventive war is ethical, then it would be moral for us to annihilate North Korea right now. But we haven't, because it's not the last resort. According to Joseph D. DeThomas, he talked about how between 2015 and 2016, the economic sanctions that the U.S. put on North Korea decreased their exports by over $1 billion. These sanctions have even opened the door for peace talks with North Korea, something that was thought impossible before these sanctions. Diplomacy is another viable option that can be used to mitigate a conflict. The fact of the matter is that there are always other options before violence, and because of that, preventive war is never a last resort. Ultimately, preventive war undermines the just war theory and is therefore unethical. But let's look at the contentions my opponent presented. His first contention is that preventive war responds to a threat by nations. My response is belief of inevitability. Again, belief of inevitability. It's important to understand that when it says belief of inevitability, what it means is that if we do nothing, then sometime in the distant future, they are going to attack us. This is really, really important because it's not saying that we know for a fact, it's not saying that it is inevitable. It's saying that we believe it's inevitable if we do nothing to stop it. But against the application of Operation Opera, my response is unsuitable for making bombs. Again, unsuitable for making bombs. Dr. Rafael Ofek is an expert in the physics and technology of nuclear power, and he said, quote, "First, the Osirak reactor that was bombed by Israel in June of 1981 was explicitly designed by a French engineer, Yves Girard, to be unsuitable for making bombs. The fact of the matter is the intelligence that Israel had was wrong. This actually proves my point that it's a belief of inevitability because Israel attacked for no reason. The bomb was unsuitable for making bombs, wasn't even designed to be used as a nuclear threat." But moving down to the second contention, he said, which is that responding to threats fulfills a moral duty. My response is other options. My opponent might think, or is making the case, that essentially if we don't use preventive war, then we can't do anything to stop the conflict. The fact of the matter is that's not true. I'm not advocating for doing nothing. What I'm advocating for is using diplomacy, using sanctions. And if the threat does become imminent, then we can attack. That's different than preventive warfare. Preventive war is when there is no imminent threat. If the threat becomes imminent, go ahead and attack. There are always other options on the table because the threat isn't imminent. But against the third contention, talking about how it fulfills the duty of deontology, that deontology determines or deems preventive war ethical, my response is that the just war theory doesn't. Again, just because we might be fulfilling our duty doesn't mean it's an ethical action, because we can fulfill our duties in immoral ways. We can protect citizens by using preventive warfare, an unnecessary war that is obviously unethical because it's not a last resort and it allows for unproportional responses. My opponent might come up here and say, but we believe that it's inevitable. That means we've exhausted all options. The fact of the matter is that's not true, because before the threat is imminent, there's always another option. And the fact of the matter is intelligence is always right, and his own application proves that to be the case. So for these reasons, I believe that preventive war is still unethical. Thanks, and I'm ready for cross-examination.
You ready for cross-ex?
Yeah.
Let's begin. Hello, I trust you're having a good day today. I just have a few questions for you. First, let's address the value. You agree to my value of protection of citizens, correct?
Yeah, I think it's obviously it's a duty of government, so it's a good way to measure the res.
And then you brought up the ethical theory of just war theory, and you talked about how a war is only justified when it fulfills the 6 prongs of just war theory, correct?
There's 7 prongs, but yeah, we don't
7 prongs, sorry.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about just war theory, it is in and of itself an ethical theory, correct? Because it's trying to determine whether a war is morally justified, right? Okay, so in order for something to be an ethical theory, there must be an ethical framework behind it. What is the ethical framework or the ethical theory behind the prongs of just war theory?
I think I think I know where this question is going, and I would agree it is to protect citizens. I'm not saying just war theory should be our value. Protection of citizens is good. What I'm saying is that we need something to keep the means in check, because all that protection.
I understand that, but what I'm specifically asking is, where do the 7 prongs of just war theory come from? Were they just made up out of thin air, or do they all derive from one principle that we can all agree is ethical?
Well, they come from religious backgrounds. It was actually from St. Thomas Aquinas, who was a saint. It's from the Christian church, but it's actually what we use today. It's what the United States international law is based on.
Why are the 7 prongs of just war theory ethical?
Because it's understood to be ethical.
Yes, but why? Why is it understood to be ethical?
Because, why is protection of citizens to be ethical? Just because it is. That's what our duty is to
do. We're just going to accept that just war theory is a good standard just because it is.
I think the fact of the matter is that everyone uses the just war theory. Pretty much.
But does that make it ethical?
Yes.
So let's say that everyone in the United States were to lie every day. Does that make lying ethical?
No, but okay, if you want to be honest, there's a higher, I don't want to bring Christianity into this, but it's based on Christianity. And
Yes.
personally, that's the objective standard of morality. I guess I can't really answer that without bringing in Christianity. That's what the just war theory is based off of.
Okay, I'll be addressing that in my next speech. Next, let's talk about your idea of a last resort. And you said that a war is only ethical when it is a last resort. You did agree that, by definition, preventive war is a war that is inevitable.
That they believe is inevitable. And the fact of the
Okay,
matter,
can a belief be based on factual information?
of course it can. I'm not
So a
arguing.
nation can believe something based on factual information that they have.
Right.
Okay, so in theory, preventive war can be based on a belief, yet still have factual information that is backing up the belief.
Right, but that information isn't always accurate. And again, if the threat isn't imminent, then they shouldn't attack because, again, there's always other options.
Okay, will a nation always know that the threat is imminent before the nation attacks?
I mean, if their intelligence is good, then yes, which is kind of the basis that's the argument that you're making, that their intelligence.
Unfortunately, I have no further time. I'll be taking prep time.
Sure.
I have 1 minute and 30 seconds remaining. This is a 4-minute speech. I'll go ahead and assume everyone's ready and begin. In today's round, me and my opponent have both proposed ethical frameworks. I have proposed deontology. My opponent has proposed just war theory. These two ethical frameworks contradict one another. They both give conflicting ideologies. So the question is, which ethical framework are we going to go with? Do we measure ethics using deontology, or do we measure ethics using just war theory? It is my stance in today's round that just war theory is not an adequate way to measure ethics. Benjamin Studebaker, who studied a lot of just war theory arguments, once said, quote, "There is no unifying principle in just war theory. The 6 principles do not all derive from one moral argument. There is no final highest principle to which they all appeal. Individual stipulations in just war theory could be dropped without creating a contradiction. They do not follow from one to the other or from one same source. This is important because in political theory, we never do this," end quote. The issue with just war theory is there's no unifying principle behind the 6 or 7 principles of just war theory. They are simply an amalgamation of different ethical worldviews thrown together in the pursuit of objective moral truth. But this is impossible. Torch von Tansino once said, quote, "These theories, deontology, moral rights theory, and utilitarianism, contradict one another. Moreover, they give conflicting, inconsistent recommendations. Hence, it is not possible to hold them together in the pursuit of moral truth," end quote. This is exactly what just war theory does. There's no one ethical theory that's behind the prongs of just war theory. My opponent says they're ethical because they're based in religion, but that's not a valid argument. He must give a reason why the 6 prongs strive from one ethical theory, and they do not contradict one another. But according to these philosophers, they do just that. The issue with just war theory is there's no unifying principle to all the prongs of just war theory. They simply say these things are ethical, so we should strive to uphold them. But that's not necessarily the case. I'll be showing that as I respond to my opponent's arguments. He talked about how preventive war is not proportional. My response to this is response to threats. My opponent has misunderstood preventive war in today's round. We're not going to be attacking any random nation that we see. We're attacking a nation that has intentionally created a threat towards us. As I stated in my case, nations do not accidentally create threats. Next, he talked about how preventive war is not a last resort. I have two responses. The first is no guarantee of imminence. No guarantee of imminence. Wars aren't supposed to be public. Let's say Cuba was going to attack Venezuela. They wouldn't make that public before they attacked. So assuming we're going to gather enough information before they attack so that we know the threat is imminent is betting or gambling with our citizens' lives. Preventive war has a prerequisite. It's stating that we currently have information that proves or shows us that a war is inevitable, and we can either act on that information or wait. My next response is diplomacy first. Diplomacy first. We must remember that preventive war does use diplomacy first. It's not just attacking any random nation that we think poses a threat. I stated that in my original case. Next, he talked about this idea that preventive war harms other nations and harms our own nation. He used the example of Operation Opera. My response to this is not acting harms. According to Henry Allen Stevenson, quote, a state cannot adequately protect itself from sustaining a potentially debilitating attack while faithfully honoring the criterion of just war theory. This goes back to my original argument. Because there's no unifying principle in just war theory, there's no way to adequately protect yourself from sustaining a potentially debilitating attack while faithfully honoring the criterion of just war theory. My opponent agreed to the value of protection of citizens. And with that value, we cannot uphold that value while faithfully honoring the criterion of just war theory. This is why we should go with deontology, as it adequately measures ethics and shows us why preventive war in the end is ethical.
Alrighty, so I have 2 minutes of prep time and I'll be using it now. Alrighty, no further prep time needed. All right, with 6 minutes on the clock, I'm just going to assume that everyone's ready and go ahead and get started. My opponent has essentially said that today we have two conflicting moral frameworks. However, I'd like to point out that these moral frameworks don't conflict at all. And that's one argument that I need to make very clear. And you can tag that as deontology and the just war theory don't conflict. Again, deontology and the just war theory don't conflict. And in fact, they actually work together quite well, because the just war theory essentially says that you have a duty not to attack using an unproportional response. You have a duty not to engage in unnecessary war or exhausting all your other options. You have a duty to fulfill this last resort. You have a duty to fulfill these criterion in order to ensure that they're ethical. However, the problem is that my opponent completely dropped the main reason why I brought the just war theory into this debate. Because deontology alone, just looking at moral duty, is not enough to determine a moral framework. We need something to keep the means in check. My opponent has not presented a single thing to keep the means in check, check. And for that reason, he hasn't actually proven the resolution true. So let's look at a couple specific arguments, and then I'll leave you with 2 voting issues. The first point of argumentation is he said against the just war theory that there's no unified principles. I have 3 responses. The first response is international law. Again, international law. You don't make international law off of something that doesn't have unified principles. There has to be unified principles. My second response is that morality is objective. Again, morality is objective. This is really important because essentially his argument is that how do we know if this principle actually fulfills moral duty? How do we know that this principle is actually ethical? How do we know that this criteria actually fulfills an ethical duty or is an ethical standard? The fact of the matter is we know because morality is objective. The reason why I talked about religion in this debate round is because that is the ethical or moral basis, the unified principle that the just war theory is based off of. And I don't really want to pin my opponent against religion, but essentially what I'm saying here is that there is a unified principle that the just war theory is based off of. And if we really want to say, if his argument is that the just war theory doesn't fulfill ethics because we don't know why it does, you can ask the same question about preventive war and deontology. Why is deontology ethical? Just because everyone fulfills certain duties doesn't mean it's ethical. The same questions can apply to literally any ethical moral framework that you bring up. The fact of the matter is morality is objective. We have to start from that basis before we can determine whether or not something is ethical or not. But my third response is that it's still necessary. Again, it's still necessary. Again, he still has dropped the main argumentation, the main reason why I brought up the just war theory, which is this, that we need something to keep the means in check. Against my argument about Operation Opera, he said that there's no acting harms. He essentially said you can't act under the just war theory. My response is the United States. The United States. The United States uses the just war theory before they morally justify going to war. They've been great at defending themselves. That actually is untrue. But moving down, but my second response is he's dropped the argument. He completely dropped his application. Guess what? The intelligence was wrong. That was not suitable for making bombs. His own application disproves his arguments. But let's go down to the first contention about how preventive war undermines the just war theory. He said that it's a response to threats. I have 2 responses. The first one is what threat? Again, what is the threat? That's the point that I'm trying to make. All you have to do to justify war under preventive war, or to justify warfare under preventive war, is to determine that there is a threat that exists. But what level is that threat at? That information is necessary in order to have a proportional response, which leads to my second argument, which is that it allows for unethical actions. Again, it allows for unethical actions. Essentially, what happens when we say preventive war is ethical is we're saying that we can just skip these other necessary criteria, and as long as we believe there's a threat, we're justified to use warfare, when the fact of the matter is that is incredibly dangerous. There are certain pieces of information necessary to justify ethically attacking someone. And one of those pieces of information is to know what level the threat is at. It's unnecessary for preventive war. It allows for unethical actions. But then he had 2 responses to subpoint B talking about a last resort. His first response is no guarantee of imminence. My response is based on intel. Again, it's based on intel. His whole entire argument about inevitability is that the intel can be amazing and that we can base everything on intelligence. The same is true with imminence. If it's true that intel can be faulty and it isn't sufficient, then his whole entire argument fails. But if intel can be sufficient, then guess what? We can wait for the imminent threat, and there are always other options. And then he talked about how diplomacy first. My response is there's no imminent threat. Again, there's no imminent threat. We can always do something if a threat isn't imminent. Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump were exchanging threats left and right. Kim Jong-un started testing missiles in our backyard. Based on all the intelligence we had from just reading a newspaper, we could say that a threat or a conflict was inevitable. If preventive war is ethical, we're allowed to annihilate North Korea. Is that ethical? Obviously not. When we determine preventive war is ethical, it allows for unethical actions. That leads to 2 voting issues. Voting issue 1, the just war theory is based on duty. Again, the just war theory is based on duty. Remember, deontology and just war theory don't conflict. They actually work really well because deontology looks at the ends and just war theory looks at the means. And if we can determine that both of those things are ethical, then guess what? It's an ethical action. But my second voting issue is preventive war fails the just war theory. My opponent's whole entire case is based that it achieves or it fulfills deontology. But that's irrelevant if it fails the just war theory. Ultimately, it's not a last resort because the threat isn't imminent, and it's unproportional, and for that reason, it's unethical. Thank you.
I'll be taking the remainder of my prep. It's a 3-minute speech. I'll assume everyone's ready and go ahead and begin. This round comes down to one question. Under deontology, preventive war is ethical. Under just war theory, it is not. Therefore, which ethical framework do we hold highest? It is my standard that just war theory is not a good ethical framework, and I'll show you why. Let's start off by responding to my opponent's justifications for just war theory. I have 3 main responses to these arguments. And the first is that just war theory and deontology contradict. Just war theory and deontology contradict. Fundamentally, the issue with just war theory is there's no one standard that it holds to. My opponent talked about how it's based on religion, but even that isn't an objective standard. I can meet 2 different Christians on the street that completely disagree on what morality is. So saying it's based on religion isn't even objective, which leads me into my next response. Just war theory has no standard. Just war theory has no standard. I brought up a quote by Benjamin Studebaker that went completely unrefuted by my opponent, specifically talking about how there's no unifying principle in just war theory, and this is important because in political theory, we never do this, end quote. I also brought up a quote by Torzban Tansino, also went unresponded to by my opponent, talking about how we can't hold a bunch of different ethical worldviews together at once because they contradict one another. But that's exactly what just war theory does. My opponent hasn't actually shown you the standards that just war theory follows. He has simply given you some prongs and said, these are good things, we should follow them. I'll be addressing this a little bit more in my next response, which is deontology is objective. Deontology is objective. Deontology gives us an objective standard that we can follow. It looks at the moral actions that we can take. This is objective because of moral law theory. But on just war theory, there is no objective standard. Next, let's respond to my opponent's case. He talked about how the intel was wrong during Operation Opera. My response was diplomacy was tried. I touched on this in cross-examination. Diplomacy was tried during Operation Opera, but it failed. Israel had no other option if they were actually going to try to protect their people. Next, he talked about how preventive war responds to threats, and he gave some different arguments against that. My response to this is prerequisite. Preventive war is not going out and attacking any nation we don't like. There are some prerequisites, like there must be an inevitable threat, and it must be a nation that is intentionally creating a threat. These are arguments never responded to by my opponent. Next, he talked about how there's no guarantee by saying that we're basing this on intel. My response to this is intel that we have versus what we think we'll get. Intel that we have versus what we think we'll get. Preventive war is based on the fact that we currently have intel that shows us that a war is inevitable. We can either act on that intel or we can wait to gather more intel. The problem is we're not guaranteed more intel. Oftentimes it's a miracle that we already have intel that proves us that a war is inevitable. Oftentimes wars can happen in mere milliseconds and millions of people can die in just days. My final argument today is the value. Ultimately, we're striving to uphold the value of protection of citizens. But as I stated in multiple quotes that went unresponded to, Just war theory doesn't allow for the protection of citizens, but deontology does. Therefore, preventive war is ethical.
Great job, Seth.